Dubrovnik 1930. Beneath a sky of blood-red lanterns, a widow's scream is cut short. Miss Jane Marple, tweed knitting needles and eyes that miss nothing, steps off an Adriatic steamer into a cliff-top villa of secrets, a codicil worth a fortune, a riddle carved in marble, a silk scarf knotted by a killer's trembling hand. Greed wears white flannels and a gambler's smile. One guest hides a torn cuff, another a forged alibi on wax. In 7 deadly nights, Marple unravels the thread from dolphin to anchor, from lantern to grave. Murder beneath the lantern skies, where every glow casts a shadow, and the sea keeps the final clue. Chapter 1. The Invitation. Miss Jane Marple stepped down from the Willowbrook Harbour omnibus at precisely 23 minutes past 3 on a golden September afternoon. The air carried the tang of tar and salt, mingled with the faint sweetness of late roses from the cottage gardens that straggled along the lane. In her gloved hand she held a small pigskin valise, and tucked inside her beaded reticule, a letter whose wax seal had already been broken twice, once by the postman in his curiosity, and once by herself in the quiet of her Willowbrook sitting-room. The letter was written on thick cream paper, the address embossed in crimson, Villa Selwyn, Straden Heights, Dubrovnik. The handwriting sloped elegantly, yet the pressure of the nib betrayed agitation. My dear Miss Marple, you will think me presumptuous, but your reputation has travelled even to these distant shores. I'm in the gravest trouble. My late husband's will contains a codicil, which certain persons here would steal or destroy. I dare not trust the local authorities entirely. Come, I implore you, as my guest. The Santa Lucia sails from Southampton on the 14th. All expenses will be met. I enclose a draft on Coots. Your obedient servant, Ariadne Selwyn Miss Marple, had turned the page over, noting the faint watermark of a Dalmatian sailing bark, and the blot where a tear, or perhaps a splash of Dubonnet, had fallen. She knew Mrs. Selwyn by repute only, widow of Cornelius Selwyn, whose steam yachts had once plied the Levant trade, and whose sudden death in a Vienna clinic the previous winter had occasioned paragraphs in the Times. The lady's distress was palpable, so was the scent of mischief. Accordingly, Miss Marple had packed 1 serviceable tweed costume, 2 afternoon frocks, a selection of wool for knitting, and her copy of the Gardener's Chronicle. She left a note for her maid Cherry, and another for the vicar's wife, who would water the geraniums. Now, on the quayside, gulls wheeled above the funnels of the Santa Lucia. The steamer's white paint gleamed, her brass rails winked in the sun. A steward in a blue reefer jacket took Miss Marple's valise and directed her up the gangway. She paused halfway to observe her fellow passengers. Colonel Bantry, red-faced, moustached, and already complaining about the heat, was handing his wife aboard as though she were a piece of fragile porcelain. Mrs. Bantry, small and bird-like, clutched a hat-box and twittered about the danger of seasickness. Behind them came a young man in a paint-spattered linen jacket, carrying a portfolio almost as tall as himself. Mr. Lucian Hale, whose portrait of the Duchess of Malfi had caused a 9-days wonder at the Royal Academy. He looked pale and interesting, as young artists are expected to do. A typewriter case announced Miss Felicity Grove before she herself appeared. Neat ankles, sensible shoes, and a smile that asked permission to exist. She was followed by a tall man in faultless white flannels, whose dark eyes flicked over the company like a banker assessing collateral. The passenger list, which Miss Marple had studied in the shipping office, named him Count Victor Dragon, of no fixed abode, but many fixed debts. Mrs. Ariadne Selwyn herself stood at the head of the gangway. She wore mourning still, though relieved by a string of pearls that caught the light like tiny moons. Her hand trembled as she greeted Miss Marple. "You came," she whispered. "I dared not hope." "Hope is a sturdy plant, my dear," Miss Marple replied, "though it sometimes requires pruning." The steward showed her to cabin 12, a neat compartment with a brass porthole, and a vase of carnations that smelled of cloves. Miss Marple unpacked, placing her knitting needles and grey wool on the writing slope. Through the porthole, she watched the chalk cliffs of England slide astern, and felt the familiar stir of anticipation. Human nature, she reflected, was much the same whether viewed from a cottage window in Willowbrook or the deck of an Adriatic steamer. Only the scenery altered. At 6:30 the dinner gong sounded. Miss Marple descended to the saloon, where the tables were already laid with heavy silver and menu cards printed in copperplate. She found herself seated between Mrs. Bantry and Miss Grove. Opposite, Count Drogon raised a glass of champagne to the company. "To new friends," he said, "and old secrets." Mrs. Selwyn, at the captain's right, toyed with her fish. Miss Marple noted that she had touched neither wine nor the excellent ragout that followed. When the lanterns were lit along the deck rails, paper globes of crimson and gold that turned the sea to a bowl of liquid fire, Mrs. Selwyn excused herself and vanished below. Colonel Bantry launched into a story of tiger shooting in Mysore. Mr. Hale sketched caricatures on the tablecloth. Miss Grove asked Miss Marple whether she preferred Dubrovnik in spring or autumn. Miss Marple replied that she had never visited the city, but understood the figs were excellent in September. Later, when the other passengers had retired to the smoke-room or their cabins, Miss Marple took a turn about the deck. The lanterns swung gently, their reflections shattered and reformed on the dark water. She paused by the rail, listening. Somewhere forward, two voices rose and fell, Mrs. Selwyn's, sharp with fear, and another low and persuasive. A man's voice, certainly. Then the scrape of a chair, the click of a cabin door. Miss Marple resumed her walk, counting her steps. At the companionway, she encountered the steward. "Everyone aboard, I think," he said cheerfully. "Everyone who admits to it," Miss Marple answered, and went below to finish the heel of her sock. Chapter 2. The Villa of Echoes. The Santa Lucia dropped anchor in the Grudge roadstead at dawn, her engines thrumming down to a sleepy heartbeat. Miss Marple, already dressed in her travelling tweed and a hat with a modest veil, stood on the starboard promenade deck and watched the old city rise from the sea like a pearl set in jade. The walls of Dubrovnik, pale gold in the early light, marched across the headland and plunged into the water with the finality of a slammed gate. Above them, terraced gardens climbed in green steps. Cypresses stood sentinel. And on the highest spur, Villa Selwyn displayed its white facade and scarlet tiles to the morning. A motor launch conveyed the passengers ashore. Mrs. Selwyn, wrapped in a dust coat of dove-grey silk, sat forward, hands clenched upon a Morocco letter-case. No one spoke. The only sounds were the slap of water against the launch's hull and the distant clang of a church bell. When they reached the marble quay, two cars waited, sleek Lancias the colour of claret. The drivers wore uniforms of the same shade, and their caps bore the Selwyn crest, a dolphin entwined about an anchor. The road climbed in hairpin bends. Oleander and myrtle brushed the windows. The scent of pine resin drifted in. Miss Marple noted the absence of other villas. The Selwyns had chosen isolation as carefully as they had chosen their pearls. At the final bend, the gates stood open, wrought iron, gilded, and topped by stone dolphins that seemed to leap forever toward the sky. Beyond lay a courtyard paved in black and white marble, where a fountain played into a basin of porphyry. Orange trees in tubs lined the walls. Their fruit glowed like lanterns against the dark leaves. Mrs. Selwyn led the way up a flight of shallow steps. The front door, massive oak studded with brass, opened before she touched it. A butler, tall and thin as a cypress, bowed with the solemnity of an undertaker. "Welcome to Villa Selwyn," Mrs. Selwyn said. Her voice echoed strangely in the vaulted hall. "Gruber will show you to your rooms. At noon we luncheon on the lower terrace. Afterwards I shall explain everything." Gruber conducted them upward along a staircase whose balustrade was carved into dolphins and tridents. The air grew cooler. The scent changed to beeswax and old parchment. Miss Marple's room overlooked the sea. It was furnished with severe elegance, a bed of polished walnut, a prie-dieu, a writing desk inlaid with mother-of-pearl. On the mantel stood a porcelain clock in the form of a ship. Its tick was the only sound. She unpacked, placing her knitting on the desk and her Bible on the bedside table. Through the open window came the murmur of waves and, faintly, the chime of the porcelain clock striking the quarter. At a few minutes before 12, she descended. The others were already gathered on the lower terrace, where a table had been laid beneath a pergola of vines. The linen was white as salt, the glassware thin as eggshell. Servants moved soundlessly, offering chilled white wine from the Pelgeshak Peninsula and tiny pastries filled with anchovy. Colonel Bantry mopped his brow. Mrs. Bantry fanned herself with a menu. Mr. Hale sketched the view. Miss Grove exclaimed over the embroidery on the napkins. Count Dragon smoked a thin cigar and watched the horizon as though expecting an invasion. Mrs. Selwyn appeared last. She had changed into a gown of black lace over ivory silk, and the pearls at her throat seemed to pulse with their own light. She took her place at the head of the table and raised a hand for silence. "My friends," she began, "you are wondering why I have summoned you across half Europe. The truth is simple and terrible. My husband, Cornelius, was not the man the world believed. Beneath his respectability lay a passion for riddles and secrets. On the night before he died in Vienna, he added a codicil to his will. It is hidden somewhere within this house. The codicil reads, 'To the first person who discovers the hiding place and solves the riddle inscribed thereon, I bequeath 1/2 of my fortune. The remainder shall endow an orphanage in Split.'" Colonel Bantry gave a bark of laughter. "Sounds like one of those treasure hunt parties the Americans are so fond of." Mrs. Selwyn's eyes did not smile. "It is no game, Colonel. Already someone has searched my husband's study. Drawers were forced, papers scattered. Last night on the steamer I received this." She produced a scrap of paper and laid it on the table. In capitals cut from a newspaper it read, "The codicil, or your life." Miss Grove gave a little scream. Mrs. Bantry clutched her husband's arm. Mr. Hale's pencil snapped in his fingers. Count Dragon merely raised an eyebrow and poured himself more wine. Miss Marple studied the note. The paste was still damp. The paper was from La Voce Dalmatica, a local journal. She noted the uneven cutting of the letters. Left-handed, she thought, and hurried. Mrs. Selwyn continued. The riddle itself is brief. Where the dolphin leaps and the anchor holds, beneath the lantern that never grows cold, seek the heart of the house, the silent word, and claim the fortune my lips have blurred. I have until the feast of St. Blaise, 3 days hence, to produce the codicil or forfeit everything to the state. I beg you, help me. Luncheon proceeded in near silence. The fish was excellent, the lamb pink and fragrant with rosemary, but appetites were small. When the coffee was served, Mrs. Selwyn rose. Explore the house, if you wish. The staff have been instructed to answer questions, but beware, someone among us is not what they seem. The company dispersed. Colonel Bantry announced his intention of inspecting the wine cellar. Mrs. Bantry declared she must lie down. Mr. Hale shouldered his sketchbook and vanished toward the gardens. Miss Grove asked to see the library. Count Drogon strolled to the balustrade and lit another cigar. Miss Marple lingered over her coffee. She observed that Mrs. Selwyn's hand shook as she replaced her cup, that the Count's eyes followed every movement of the hostess, that Mr. Hale had left his broken pencil on the table. Cedarwood, imported, expensive. She finished her coffee, folded her napkin into precise thirds, and set off on a tour of her own. The villa was larger than it appeared from the sea. Corridors branched like the veins of a leaf. Staircases spiraled upward into shadow. In the entrance hall, a suit of armour stood guard, its visor lifted to reveal emptiness. Portraits glared down, sea captains with forked beards, ladies in bombazine, a boy in velvet clutching a model ship. Miss Marple paused before the last. The brass plate read, Cornelius Selwyn, Etat, 12/1891. The eyes were already calculating. She found the library on the first floor, a long room panelled in cedar, smelling of leather and candle smoke. Tall windows gave onto the terrace. Between them stood a globe on a mahogany stand. Books rose to the ceiling. Volumes on navigation, trade, cryptography. A ladder on brass rails invited ascent. Miss Grove was already there, running a finger along the spines. "Isn't it marvellous?" she said. "I could spend a year here." Miss Marple smiled. "Knowledge is a great comforter, my dear, but sometimes dangerous." She noted the disorder on the central table. Papers, a magnifying glass, a scatter of cut-out letters identical to those in the threatening note. Someone had been practicing. From the library, she passed to the late Mr. Selwyn's study. It was locked. Gruber, appearing as if conjured, produced a key. "Madame's orders," he said. His accent was Viennese, precise as a watchmaker. The study was smaller, more intimate. A partner's desk faced the window. Above it hung a chart of the Adriatic currents. Drawers had been forced, as Mrs. Selwyn said. One still gaped like a wound. On the blotter lay a single playing card, the knave of spades, its corner torn. Miss Marple picked it up. The tear was fresh. The card smelled faintly of Turkish tobacco. She moved to the window. Below, the terrace lay empty save for a single lantern of red paper, left over from some festival. It swung in the breeze, though the day was still. She made a mental note. The afternoon waned. Tea was served in the salon. Silver samovar, plum cake, cucumber sandwiches cut wafer thin. Conversation was desultory. Colonel Bantry complained that the cellar contained only Dalmatian wines. "Fit for peasants," Mrs. Bantry described a headache. Mr. Hale showed sketches of the fountain. The dolphins had become sinister, almost grinning. Miss Grove asked whether anyone played bridge. Count Dragon declined, pleading correspondence. At 6 o'clock the sun dropped behind the mountains, and the villa was bathed in violet shadow. Lanterns were lit along the terraces, dozens of them, paper globes in crimson, gold and emerald swaying like fruit. Their light turned the marble to rose and the sea to ink. Dinner was announced for 8. Miss Marple retired to dress. In her room she opened her knitting bag and drew out not wool, but a small notebook bound in morocco. She wrote, threatening note, left-handed, local paper, playing card, knave of spades, torn corner, tobacco, lantern on terrace, moving without wind, study lock, scratched, forced from inside. Count Dragon, watches hostess, Mr. Hale, nervous, breaks pencil. Mrs. Selwyn, frightened but hiding something. She closed the book, slipped it into her reticule, and went down to dinner. The dining room was a cavern of candlelight. The table glittered with crystal and old silver. Mrs. Selwyn, in black velvet now, sat between Colonel Bantry and the Count. Conversation turned to travel, to art, to the price of figs. Beneath the politeness ran a current of unease, like the hum of a distant generator. After the soufflé, Mrs. Selwyn rose. "I retire early," she said. "The excitement, you understand. Gruber will serve liqueurs in the salon. Please enjoy the lanterns. They are rather fine." She left. The door closed behind her with the soft finality of a coffin lid. Miss Marple excused herself soon after. In the hall she paused, listening. From the upper landing came the faint creak of a floorboard, then silence. She climbed the stairs slowly, her kid slippers making no sound. At the turn of the corridor she saw a line of light beneath Mrs. Selwyn's door, then darkness as the lamp was extinguished. Back in her own room she opened the window. The night air was cool, scented with jasmine and salt. Below, the lanterns glowed, their reflections trembled on the water. Somewhere, a nightingale began to sing. Miss Marple sat by the window and took up her knitting, but her eyes were on the terrace. At 12:15 precisely she heard it, the scrape of gravel, the soft closing of the French window from the library to the garden. A figure passed beneath the lanterns, tall, indistinct, moving with purpose. It paused by the red lantern, reached up, and for a moment the light swung wildly. Then all was still. Miss Marple counted to 100, slowly. No further sound. She closed the window, drew the curtains, and went to bed. But she did not sleep. In the darkness, she reviewed the day, fitting each small observation into its place like pieces of a jigsaw. Human beings, she reflected, were predictable in their unpredictability. Greed, fear, love, always the same motives, merely different costumes. Outside, the lanterns, burned on, faithful and deceptive, until the moon paled and the first hint of dawn crept over the Adriatic. Chapter 3. The Body in the Garden. The first scream came at 7:30, thin and metallic, as though a gull had been caught in a trap. Miss Marple, already dressed and descending the staircase with the measured tread of one who has never hurried in her life, paused on the half-landing. The sound rose again, unmistakably human, and was cut short by the crash of a dropped tray. Gruber appeared from the service corridor, his face the colour of wet parchment. "Madam," he began, and could say no more. He pointed toward the French windows that opened from the dining room to the lower terrace. Miss Marple followed. The morning was flawless, sky the pale blue of a thrush's egg, sea glittering like scattered diamonds. The lanterns of the previous night still hung in place, their paper globes faded to the colour of old blood in the sunlight. Beneath the pergola of vines where breakfast had been laid the day before, a small tableau of horror was arranged. Mrs. Ariadne Selwyn lay on her back among the scattered petals of crushed oleander. Her black velvet gown had ridden above one knee. A silk scarf, pale blue, embroidered with tiny silver anchors, was knotted tight about her throat. The knot had bitten deep into the flesh. The face above it was congested, the tongue slightly protruded. One arm was flung wide, the fingers curled as though clutching at the empty air. The other lay across her breast, the hand still gloved in black kid. A single pearl earring dangled from the left ear. The right lobe was torn and bare. Miss Felicity Grove stood a few paces away, both hands pressed to her mouth. A silver coffee pot lay on its side, a dark stain spreading across the marble. Colonel Bantry, in shirt sleeves and braces, was bending over the body. His face had the purplish hue of a man about to suffer an apoplectic stroke. "Dead," he announced unnecessarily. "Strangled! Good God!" Mrs. Bantry appeared in the doorway, wrapper clutched about her throat, and gave a small, ladylike shriek before subsiding onto a stone bench. Mr. Lucian Hale, sketchbook dangling, stared with the fascinated horror of an artist who has stumbled upon the perfect subject. Count Dragon, immaculate in dove grey, lit a cigarette with deliberate calm and exhaled toward the sky. Miss Marple approached the body. She did not touch it, but her eyes, pale blue and deceptively mild, took in every detail. The scarf was Mrs. Selwyn's own. She had worn it the previous evening, knotted loosely at the side. Now it was drawn from behind, the knot clumsy, almost a granny knot, the sort a child might tie in a moment of panic. The oleander petals beneath the shoulders were bruised but not broken. The body had been placed, not dragged. A faint scent of Turkish tobacco clung to the air, mingling with the sweetness of the flowers. She stooped, careful not to disturb the gravel. Beneath the pergola's central post, iron, painted white, and supporting a large crimson lantern, she noted a single footprint. Narrow, heeled, the mark of a woman's court shoe. The gravel around it was undisturbed. Someone had stood there, reached upward, and then stepped back. "Gruber," she said quietly. "Telephone the police. Ask for Captain Nikolic at the Questura. Tell him it is murder." The butler hesitated, then bowed and disappeared. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. "Ought to cover her up, what? Decency!" Miss Marple shook her head. "Nothing must be touched, Colonel. The scarf, the position of the hands, the missing earring, everything has its significance." Mrs. Bantry began to weep softly into a lace handkerchief. Miss Grove, recovering her voice, whispered, "I came down early to fetch my typewriter ribbon. I saw her feet first, sticking out from the vines." Count Dragon flicked ash from his cigarette. "A tragedy, but perhaps not unexpected. Madame spoke of threats." Mr. Hale closed his sketchbook with a snap. "I was in the studio all night. The light is perfect at dawn. I saw no one." Miss Marple noted that his fingers were stained with Prussian blue, and that a smear of the same colour decorated the cuff of his linen jacket. Within 20 minutes the courtyard filled with the sound of boots on gravel. Captain Nikolic arrived in a cloud of dust, accompanied by 2 constables and a photographer, whose camera looked older than the Republic. Nikolic was young, dark, and impeccably uniformed. His English was precise, learned, at the University of Zagreb. Miss Marple, he said, bowing slightly. Your reputation precedes you. Madame Selwyn wrote to Scotland Yard. They recommended you most highly. I am merely a guest, Miss Marple replied, but I have seen death before. Shall we begin? Nikolic knelt beside the body. He examined the scarf, the torn earlobe, the crushed petals. Strangulation, he confirmed. Between 11 o'clock and 1, I should say. The rigour is just beginning in the jaw. No sign of a weapon. The scarf was the instrument. The knot is amateur, pulled tight in haste. He rose. The house is sealed. No one leaves until I give permission. Statements will be taken in the library. Dr. Jovanovic is on his way to certify death. The photographer began his work, the flash powder popping like small fireworks. Servants were herded into the kitchen wing. The guests were shepherded indoors. Miss Marple lingered a moment longer studying the pergola. The crimson lantern above the body still swayed gently, though there was no wind. She reached up and touched the iron post. It was warm from the night's lamps, but inside the hollow base something shifted with a faint metallic click. She made a mental note and followed the others inside. The library smelled of cedar and fear. Statements were taken in order of arrival. Colonel Bantry. Played billiards alone until 1, drank a whisky, went to bed, heard nothing. Mrs. Bantry. Took a veronal at 11, slept like the dead, pardon the expression. Mr. Hale. Worked in the studio until 3. Moonlight on the water, magnificent, no visitors. Miss Grove. Headache, went to bed at 10, read for an hour, asleep by 11. Count Dragon. Telephoned a friend in Split at 12:30. The operator will confirm. Then to bed. Miss Marple, when her turn came, spoke mildly. I sat by my window until 12:30, knitting. I heard the library window open and close at 12:15. Someone crossed the terrace and paused beneath the pergola. I saw a figure, tall I think, reach up to the lantern. Then all was quiet. Nikolic made a note. You are certain of the time? The porcelain clock in my room strikes the quarters. It is accurate to the second. The doctor arrived, a stooped man with a goatee. He confirmed strangulation, estimated time of death between 11:30 and 12:30, and departed shaking his head over the folly of rich widows. By noon the house was a hive of subdued activity. Constables dusted for fingerprints. The scarf was bagged. The missing earring sought in every corner. Miss Marple requested permission to examine Mrs. Selwyn's bedroom. Nikolic, intrigued, accompanied her. The room was untouched. The bed had not been slept in. The black velvet gown lay across a chair exactly as the maid had left it. On the dressing table stood the jewel case, open, the lid thrown back. Inside lay the mate to the remaining pearl earring, its clasp broken. A faint smear of blood, Mrs. Selwyn's own, marked the velvet lining. Miss Marple opened the wardrobe. Dresses hung in regimented rows, black, ivory, one of dove-grey silk. On the floor, half concealed by the hem of a dressing gown, lay a scrap of navy wool, caught on the iron foot of the bedstead. She picked it up with a handkerchief. It was coarse, the sort used for yachting jackets. Downstairs, luncheon was a travesty. Cold meats, salad, fruit, no one ate. Conversation was limited to murmurs of shock. Count Dragon poured himself a large brandy and stared out at the sea. At 3 o'clock, Nikolic assembled them again in the salon. The codicil is missing, he announced. We have searched the study, the library, the safe. Nothing. Whoever killed Madame Selwyn took it, or believes they know where it is hidden. Colonel Bantry exploded. "Damned foreigner! Probably one of the servants." Nikolich's eyes flashed. "The servants have been with the family for 20 years, Colonel. Their alibis are solid. It is among you, ladies and gentlemen, that the murderer sits." Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, looked up. "Captain, may I suggest we examine the lanterns? The riddle speaks of the lantern that never grows cold. Last night they burned until dawn. One, perhaps, hides more than paper." Nikolich considered, then nodded. "At dusk, the light may reveal what daylight conceals." The afternoon dragged. Miss Grove took to her room with smelling salts. Mrs. Bantry embroidered a tray cloth with trembling fingers. Mr. Hale disappeared into the garden with his paints. Count Dragon played patience at a card table, his movements precise as a surgeon's. Miss Marple walked the terraces alone. She noted the footprint beneath the pergola. Size 5, Louis heel, the sole worn on the outer edge. She examined the iron post again. The crimson lantern was fixed by a single screw. Inside, something glinted. She did not touch it. At 6 the sun began its descent, turning the sea to molten copper. Lanterns were lit once more, fewer now, their glow softer, almost mournful. The guests gathered beneath the pergola. Nikolich carried a small step-ladder. One by one the lanterns were unscrewed. Nothing, the fifth, smaller, of opaque glass, yielded a roll of parchment tied with red ribbon. Nikolich unrolled it carefully. It was blank. A gasp ran through the company. Count Dragon smiled thinly. "A clever jest." Miss Marple shook her head. "No jest, Count. A decoy. The real codicil is elsewhere, and the murderer knows where." Night fell. The house settled into uneasy quiet. Somewhere a clock struck 9. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles motionless. She was thinking of knots, of footprints, of a torn earring and a scrap of navy wool, and of a lantern that had swung without wind. Chapter 4. Threads and Knots. The house woke to a morning of thin, reluctant light. A mist had drifted in from the sea and lay across the terraces like a damp sheet. The lanterns, unlit now, dripped with dew. Captain Nikolich had stationed a constable at each external door, and another beneath the pergola, where the body had been removed at dawn to the mortuary in the old town. The guests breakfasted in near silence, the clink of cutlery sounding unnaturally loud in the vaulted dining room. Miss Marple took only coffee and a slice of bread. She observed the others over the rim of her cup. Colonel Bantry buttered toast with unnecessary violence. Mrs. Bantry crumbled a roll and let the pieces fall. Mr. Hale's eyes were red-rimmed, whether from sleeplessness or paint fumes she could not tell. Miss Grove kept her gaze on her plate. Count Dragon read a newspaper printed in Zagreb, and turned the pages with a rustle that set everyone's teeth on edge. At 9:30, Nikolich summoned them to the library. The blank parchment lay on the central table beside the threatening note, the knave of spades, and the scrap of navy wool which Miss Marple had surrendered the previous evening. "Fingerprints," Nikolich announced. "The scarf yields many, Madame's own, the maid's, and one clear set on the knot." "A man's thumb, I think. The note is clean, the paper is common. The playing card has a smear of Turkish tobacco, same as on the scarf. The wool—" Dobe held it to the light. "From a garment of good quality. Navy thread, mercerized English manufacture." Colonel Bantry snorted. "Half the Royal Navy wears Navy man." "Precisely," said Nikolich. "We shall examine wardrobes." Miss Marple requested permission to visit the late Mrs. Selwyn's bedroom again. Nikolic, curious, accompanied her. The room had been searched. Drawers stood open, the mattress was askew. On the dressing table, the jewel case remained, lid closed now. Miss Marple opened it. The broken pearl earring lay where she had left it. She lifted the velvet tray. Beneath was a small key of blackened iron, no longer than her little finger. She turned it in her palm. "The key to something small," she murmured. "A cabinet, perhaps, or a musical box." Nikolic took it. "We found no locket fits." "Yet," said Miss Marple. Downstairs the wardrobe inspection began. Colonel Bantry produced a blazer of naval serge, blue but a different shade, and the buttons were mother of pearl. Mr. Hale's painting smock was navy, paint-stained, but intact. Miss Grove's travelling coat was navy wool, the hem let down with a darker thread. Count Dragon opened a leather valise and displayed a yachting jacket, navy, brass buttons, a tear at the cuff where a thread exactly matched the scrap. "Careless of me," he said smoothly. "Caught it on a stanchion in Monte Carlo. The tailor will mend it." Miss Marple examined the tear. It was fresh. The wool had not been brushed. A single fibre clung to the brass button. Nikolic bagged the jacket. "We shall compare," the Count shrugged. "As you wish. I was in my cabin telephoning Split. The operator will be questioned again," Nikolic finished. "The line from the library extension passes through the main hall. It was reported faulty yesterday morning. Curious." Miss Marple asked to see the telephone apparatus. In the hall stood a walnut cabinet with a candlestick telephone. The wire disappeared through the floor. She lifted the receiver. The line was dead. Nikolic produced a pocket knife and opened the baseboard. The wire had been severed cleanly and rejoined with insulating tape still bearing the price 3 dinars from a shop in the Straden. "Cut and mended within the last 24 hours, he said. Miss Marple nodded. "A recording, perhaps? A gramophone in the cellar, a clockwork mechanism." The operator heard a voice, but no breathing, no hesitation. Clever, but not clever enough. Count Dragon's smile did not waver. At 11 the maids were interviewed. The housekeeper, a stout woman named Mara, remembered lighting the lanterns at dusk. Madame herself insisted. She said the riddle spoke of lanterns, and she wished them all burning. The undermaid, Anna, had seen Mr. Hale in the garden at 10 o'clock, painting by moonlight. "He waved his brush at me," she said, blushing. No one else had been abroad. Luncheon was omitted. Sandwiches were sent to the library. Miss Marple ate nothing. She requested the household accounts and spent the afternoon in the late Mr. Selwyn's study, surrounded by ledgers and nautical charts. The safe stood open. Its contents, bonds, share certificates, a packet of love letters tied with faded ribbon, had been inventoried. She noted that the love letters were addressed to a lady in Trieste and dated 1919. Mrs. Selwyn had been the second wife. On the blotter lay a sheet of paper covered with doodles. Dolphins, anchors, the words lantern and heart repeated in a spidery hand. Beneath, almost obscured, a sketch of the pergola with an arrow pointing to the central post. Miss Marple folded the sheet and slipped it into her reticule. At 4 o'clock, Captain Nikolic received a telegram from Split. The operator confirmed a call at 12:30, but the voice had been muffled, as though spoken through cloth. Duration? 43 seconds. No questions asked, no replies given. Nikolic looked at Count Dragon. "Your friend, what did you discuss?" "Investments," the Count said. "He is a cautious man. He listens more than he speaks." Miss Marple asked permission to examine the cellar. It was reached by a stone stair behind the kitchen. The air was cool, smelling of wine and apples. Barrels lined one wall. On a bench stood a gramophone with a large horn. Beside it lay a wax cylinder in a cardboard sleeve. Nikolic wound the handle. A man's voice, cultured, faintly accented, issued forth, "Yes, tomorrow, the usual terms." 43 seconds exactly. The voice was Count Dragon's own. The Count's composure cracked for the first time. "A precaution," he said. "One is sometime indiscreet on the telephone." Nikolic smiled without warmth. "We shall see." Tea was served on the upper terrace. The mist had lifted. The sun struck sparks from the sea. Miss Marple took a cucumber sandwich and addressed the company. "The murderer," she said conversationally, "knew the riddle by heart. He or she believed the codicil to be hidden in the lantern above the pergola. That is why the body was placed directly beneath it, why the lantern was made to swing. A signal, perhaps, or a distraction. The scarf was taken from Madame's own drawer, the knot tied in haste by someone unused to violence. The missing earring was torn away in the struggle. Madame was a strong woman. She fought for her life." Colonel Bantry harumphed. "All very well, but who?" Miss Marple turned to Miss Grove. "You discovered the body, my dear. You came down early for a typewriter ribbon. Yet your machine is in your room, and the ribbon is new. Why the lie?" Miss Grove flushed. I couldn't sleep. I thought a walk." "In court shoes. The footprint beneath the pergola is yours. Size 5, Louis heel, worn on the outer edge. You stood on tiptoe to reach the lantern, then stepped back. The gravel shows it." Miss Grove began to cry. "I only wanted to help. Madame asked me to watch the lanterns. She suspected someone would tamper with them. I saw nothing, I swear." Miss Marple's voice softened. "You saw more than you admit. You found the body already dead, and you screamed. But you moved the scarf slightly. Your fingerprints are on the silk beside the knot. Why? I thought to loosen it, but it was too late." Count Dragon laughed. "A pretty theory, Miss Marple, but the wool is from my jacket, the voice on the cylinder mine. You have no proof I left my cabin." Miss Marple opened her reticule and produced the doodled sheet. "Your proof, Count, is in Mr. Selwyn's own hand. The arrow points to the post. You searched the wrong lantern. The real hiding place is elsewhere." She turned to Nikolic. "Captain, may we have the iron key from the jewel case? I believe it fits the musical box on Madame's night table." The box was brought. It was of rosewood, inlaid with mother-of-pearl dolphins. The key turned with a soft click. Inside, nestled on faded silk, lay a second roll of parchment. Nikolic unrolled it carefully. The codicil was genuine, witnessed by 2 notaries in Vienna. It repeated the riddle and added a line in Mr. Selwyn's hand. "The heart of the house is the hearth that never burns." Miss Marple looked at the company. "The great fireplace in the salon. The one that has not been lit since the war. The codicil is behind the fireback." Nikolic dispatched a constable. Minutes later he returned with a third parchment, sealed in red wax. The fortune was intact. Count Dragon rose. "A charming entertainment," he said, "but I fear I must leave. My yacht is at Bruges." Nikolic stepped forward. "You will remain, Count. The wool, the voice, the torn cuff, Enough for a warrant." The Count's hand dipped toward his pocket. Colonel Bantry, quicker than his bulk suggested, brought his walking stick down across the wrist. A small pistol clattered to the tiles. Miss Marple sighed. "Violence is so unnecessary." Dusk fell. The lanterns were not lit. In the salon, the great hearth yawned black and empty. The codicil lay on the table, its secret safe. Outside, the sea whispered against the rocks, and somewhere a nightingale tried a tentative phrase and thought better of it. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. Another thread had been followed to its end. Chapter 5. The Riddle Unfolds. The evening meal was a travesty of hospitality. The long table in the dining room had been set for 8. The 8th place, Mrs. Selwyn's, remained empty. The chair turned backward, as though the house itself had drawn a curtain across her memory. Candles guttered in silver sconces. The mirrors reflected pale faces and the flicker of suspicion. No one spoke of appetite. A single course, cold consommé in Sèvres cups, was taken and abandoned. Captain Nikolic had stationed constables at every door. Count Dragon sat between 2 of them, wrists lightly bound with silk cord. His composure had thinned to the brittle gloss of a man who still believes a card may yet turn in his favour. Colonel Bantry glowered. Mrs. Bantry dabbed at her eyes with a scrap of lace. Mr. Hale stared at the ceiling as though answers might be written in the plaster roses. Miss Grove kept her hands folded so tightly that the knuckles showed white. Miss Marple, seated at the foot of the table, finished her soup and laid the spoon across the bowl with precision. She waited until the silence had stretched to Bacon, then spoke in the mild tone she might have used to remark upon the weather. "The codicil is safe," she began, "but the riddle is not yet solved." Mr. Selwyn wrote, "Where the dolphin leaps and the anchor holds, beneath the lantern that never grows cold." We have examined lanterns of paper and glass. We have unscrewed iron posts and found only emptiness. The hearth in the salon has not been lit these 20 years, yet it is the heart of the house. The hearth, you will notice, is flanked by dolphins carved in marble, and above the mantel hangs an anchor of gilded bronze. The lantern that never grows cold is the electric sconce fitted last spring directly over the fireback. Colonel Bantry gave a snort. Electric light? Selwyn was mad for riddles, but he wasn't an electrician. Nevertheless, Miss Marple continued, the sconce was installed by a firm in Trieste. The invoice is in the estate office. The workman left a note. Wiring passes behind fireback. Access panel concealed. Captain Nikolic rose. We shall open it at once. The company moved to the salon as though drawn by a single thread. The great fireplace yawned beneath its carved dolphins. The anchor above gleamed dully. Nikolic produced a screwdriver. The panel, painted to match the stone, came away with a soft click. Inside lay a tin box, green with verdigris. He lifted it out. The box was locked. Miss Marple produced the small iron key from Mrs. Selwyn's jewel case. It turned sweetly. Within, on a bed of yellowed cotton wool, rested a final parchment, rolled and sealed with black wax. Nikolic broke the seal. The document was brief. To whomsoever finds this, the fortune is illusion. The true bequest is the knowledge that greed destroys. The money is already given. To the orphanage in Split, irrevocably, by deed of gift dated the day I sailed for Vienna. The codicil you sought was a decoy, to flush the serpent from the grass, play the game, and learn. Below, in a trembling hand, Ariadne knew. Forgive her. Silence fell, thick as dust. Count Dragon laughed once, sharply. A jest. The old fox played us all for fools. Miss Marple regarded him steadily. Not all, Count. Mrs. Selwyn believed the codicil genuine. She feared for her life because she intended to honour a promise made on her husband's deathbed, to protect the orphanage from claimants. You discovered the decoy in the pergola lantern and killed her to silence her before she revealed the truth. Nikolic unrolled a second sheet found beneath the first, a letter in Mrs. Selwyn's hand, addressed to Miss Marple. If I die, look to the Count. He owes Monte Carlo £50,000. He believes the fortune real. The rest is play-acting to trap him. God forgive me. Miss Grove gave a small, broken cry. She asked me to watch the lanterns. She said it was a game. I thought she was afraid of ghosts. Mr. Hale set down his glass. I painted the pergola at midnight. I saw the Count leave the library window. I thought he was meeting a woman. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat. And I heard the gramophone in the cellar. Thought it was the wireless. Miss Marple folded her hands. Each of you saw a fragment. The Count cut the telephone wire, recorded his voice, and played it at 12:30 to establish an alibi. He lured Mrs. Selwyn to the pergola with a forged note, paper from her own desk, ink from her pen. She went willingly, believing she would confront the thief. He strangled her with her own scarf, tore the earring in the struggle, and searched the lantern. Finding nothing, he left her beneath it as a warning or a signature. Count Dragon's eyes glittered. Pretty, Miss Marple, but the wool from my jacket, the tobacco, circumstance. The wool was torn when you climbed the pergola post, Miss Marple said. You are tall. The cuff caught on the iron hook. The tobacco is your brand, Sobrani, black, gold-tipped. The maid Anna emptied your ashtray this morning, and the knave of spades, your calling card in Monte Carlo, where you are known as Il Fante. Nikolic produced handcuffs. Victor Dragon, I arrest you for the murder of Ariadne Selwyn. The Count lunged. The constables were ready. He was borne backward into a chair. His face, stripped of its mask, was grey. Miss Marple turned to the hearth. The riddle was never about money. It was about truth. Mr. Selwyn knew his wife's courage and the Count's desperation. The fortune was given long ago. The orphanage will thrive. She looked at the company. Let us leave the lanterns dark tonight. They have served their purpose. Chapter 6. Lanterns Out. The arrest of Count Victor Dragon took place in the salon at 9:20, with the precision of a well-rehearsed charade. Captain Nikolic snapped the handcuffs shut. The click echoed off the vaulted ceiling like a judge's gavel. Dragon did not struggle further. The fight had gone out of him the moment the final parchment was read. He sat very straight, the silk cord replaced by steel, and stared at the cold hearth as though it might yet yield another secret. Colonel Bantry, flushed with triumph, demanded brandy. Mrs. Bantry revived sufficiently to insist upon a hot water bottle. Mr. Hale asked permission to fetch his sketchbook. Nikolic refused. Miss Grove wept quietly into her sleeve. Miss Marple alone remained composed, winding her grey wool with the calm of a woman completing a sleeve. Nikolic addressed the room. The Count will be taken to the Questura. Statements will be signed. The villa remains sealed until the magistrate arrives tomorrow. You will sleep here tonight. Dragon spoke for the first time since the cuffs closed. His voice was soft, almost conversational. You have the wrong man, Captain. I wanted the money, yes, but I did not kill her. Miss Marple paused in her knitting. Then who did, Count? He smiled without warmth. Ask the artist. He was in the garden at midnight. Ask the typist. She found the body too conveniently. Ask the colonel. He plays billiards alone, but the balls were not chalked this morning. Colonel Bantry bristled. Damned impudence! Nikolic silenced him with a look. We have evidence, Count. The wool, the tobacco, the gramophone cylinder, the forged note in Madame's handwriting, your left hand, your paper, your ink. The earring torn in the struggle matches the clasp broken in your haste. You climbed the post, the hook caught your cuff. You left the knave of spades as a flourish. It is finished. Dragan shrugged. Believe what you will. I shall appeal to Vienna. My cousin is ambassador. Your cousin, Nikolic said dryly, is currently explaining your Monte Carlo debts to the legation. There will be no appeal. The constables led him away. His footsteps echoed down the marble corridor, then faded. The front door closed with solemn finality. Miss Marple rose. Captain, may I see the pergola once more? There is a small matter of the footprint. Nikolic hesitated, then nodded. They walked together through the French windows. The night was moonless. The lanterns had not been lit. The pergola stood in darkness, the iron post a pale shaft against the vines. Miss Marple produced a small electric torch from her reticule. Cherry had insisted upon its inclusion, and shone it on the gravel. The footprint was still there, delicate, healed. Beside it, half concealed by a fallen leaf, lay a second impression. Broader, square-toed, the mark of a man's evening shoe. The gravel had been raked smooth around both. Two people, Nikolic murmured. Exactly, said Miss Marple. Miss Grove stood on tiptoe to reach the lantern. She is short. The second print is deeper on the outer edge. The man shifted his weight as he lifted her down. He wore patent leather. See the polished gleam? Count Dragan's shoes are suede. Someone helped her after the murder, or before. They returned to the salon. The company had not moved. Miss Marple addressed Miss Grove. My dear, you told us you came down for a typewriter ribbon. Yet the ribbon is new, and your machine is in your room. You went to the pergola because Mrs. Selwyn asked you to watch. What did you see? Miss Grove's tears had dried. She looked suddenly older. She gave me a note at dinner, said to meet her at 11:30 beneath the crimson lantern. I waited. No one came. At 12, I heard a sound, like a cough, cut off. I ran forward and found her, already gone. I tried to loosen the scarf. My fingers left marks. Then I screamed. And the second person? I saw a shadow, tall, moving fast toward the library. I thought it was the Count. I was afraid to say. Mr. Hale spoke. It was I. I had been painting the moonlight on the water. I heard the scream and ran. I saw Miss Grove kneeling. I helped her up. My shoe left the print. I thought to spare her further distress. I said nothing because I am a coward. Miss Marple nodded. Fear makes cowards of us all. But the murderer is taken. The rest is explanation. Colonel Bantry poured himself another brandy. Damned foreign nonsense. Back to civilized parts tomorrow, eh, Dolly? Mrs. Bantry murmured agreement. Miss Grove asked permission to go to her room. Mr. Hale requested paper and charcoal. Nikolic allowed it under supervision. Miss Marple returned to her knitting. The pattern was nearly complete. A scarf in a cable stitch, neat and strong. She thought of Mrs. Selwyn, brave in her deception, and of the orphanage in Split that would never know its benefactor's name. She thought of Count Dragan, whose greed had led him to a prison cell instead of a palace. Human nature, she reflected, was a tapestry of light and shadow. One had only to follow the threads. At 11 o'clock the house settled into stillness. The constables patrolled the corridors. The guests retired under guard. Miss Marple sat by her window a little longer. The sea was black glass. The stars were sharp as pins. Somewhere below, a lantern, forgotten perhaps, swayed in the breeze and tapped gently against its post. Tap, tap, tap. A small, patient sound, like a heartbeat. She closed the curtains, drew the bolsters straight, and went to bed. Sleep came quickly. She dreamed of dolphins leaping through green waves, and of an anchor resting secure on a seabed of gold. In the morning, the Santa Lucia would sail. The villa would be shuttered, the lanterns taken down. The riddle was solved, the serpent caught. Miss Marple slept the sleep of the just, and the Adriatic kept its ancient secrets. Chapter 7. Dawn over the Adriatic. The Santa Lucia weighed anchor at 7, slipping from the Bruges roadstead as quietly as a secret. A pale sun climbed behind the mountains, gilding the old city walls and turning the sea to milk glass. On the promenade deck, the passengers stood in small separate groups, wrapped in coats against the morning chill. No one spoke of the night before. The murder, the arrest, the hollow codicil, all seemed part of another voyage, another life. Miss Marple leaned on the rail, her valise at her feet, her knitting bag over her arm. The cable scarf was finished, folded, and ready for the vicar's jumble sail. She watched Dubrovnik shrink to a white comma on the horizon and felt the familiar tug of departure. Another pattern completed. Motive, opportunity, lie, truth. All neat as 9pence. Captain Nikolic had come aboard to bid farewell. He stood beside her now, cap under his arm, the handcuffed count already in the custody of 2 marine guards below. "The orphanage will receive the full amount," he said. "The Vienna lawyers confirmed the deed of gift this morning. Mrs. Selwyn's courage was not in vain." Miss Marple nodded. "She played her part to the end. A brave woman, Captain. And you, Miss Marple. An honour to work with you. Scotland Yard will hear of it." She smiled gently. "I'm only an old maid who notices things. Human nature is my study, not fame." He bowed and left her. The deck cleared. Colonel Bantry appeared, red-faced and impatient, complaining that the bacon was overcooked. Mrs. Bantry followed, clutching a new hat box and twittering about Venetian glass. Mr. Hale sketched the wake, his pencil moving with quick, nervous strokes. Miss Grove stood alone at the stern, a letter in her hand, addressed, Miss Marple noted, to the orphanage matron. The steamer gathered speed. The walls of Dubrovnik vanished. Only the mountains remained, blue and distant. Miss Marple took a turn about the deck, pausing to watch a school of dolphins arc through the water. Silver, effortless, free. She thought of the carved dolphins in the villa hearth, forever leaping, forever anchored. A riddle within a riddle. At noon the gong sounded for luncheon. The passengers assembled in the saloon, conversation careful, eyes avoiding the empty chair that would have been Count Dragon's. The menu was printed in copperplate. Consommé printanier, filet de sole bonne femme, tornados Rossini. No one had appetite, yet the ritual was observed. Colonel Bantry carved the beef with martial vigour. "Back to Blighty tomorrow," he announced. "Trout streams, decent claret, no more foreign nonsense." Mrs. Bantry planned a new frock for the WI garden party. Mr. Hale spoke of an exhibition in Bond Street. Miss Grove mentioned a secretarial post in London. Something steady, she said with a shy smile. Miss Marple ate sparingly. She listened, observed, and said little. After coffee, she returned to the deck. The coast of Italy lay ahead, a thin line of amethyst. She opened her notebook and wrote in her neat slanted hand, Count Dragon, greed, forgery, murder. Sentence, life. Miss Grove, innocent, brave in small things. Mr. Hale, cowardice redeemed by confession. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry, unchanged, unchangeable Mrs. Selwyn, heroine of her own tragedy. She closed the book, slipped it into her reticule, and took up her knitting, mittens now, for the Willowbrook district nurse. The needles clicked softly, a counterpoint to the engines. At 4 o'clock the Santa Lucia passed the island of Korčula, its medieval town glowing like a jewel. A bell rang for tea. Miss Marple declined. She remained at the rail, watching, the sun sink toward the water in a blaze of copper and rose. The dolphins had gone. Gulls wheeled overhead, crying of home. When the light failed, she went below. Her cabin was tidy, the porthole framing a square of indigo sky. She unpacked her Bible, read a chapter of Proverbs, and turned out the lamp. The ship's motion rocked her gently. Sleep came without dreams. Southampton greeted them with drizzle and the smell of coal smoke. Customs officers chalked the luggage. Porters shouted. Taxis honked. Miss Marple descended the gangway, valise in hand, and found Cherry waiting with the Willowbrook carrier's van. "Any adventures, ma'am?" Cherry asked, stowing the bag. "A pleasant voyage," Miss Marple replied. "The figs were excellent." At the cottage, the geraniums had thrived. The vicar's wife had left a sponge cake. Miss Marple hung her hat, filled the kettle, and sat in her chair by the window. Outside, the village slept beneath a lavender dusk. She thought of lanterns swinging above a dark sea, of a woman who had died to protect a promise, of a count who would never again see Monte Carlo. The kettle sang. She poured tea, added milk, and took one sip. Another case closed, another pattern complete. Tomorrow she would weed the herb bed and write to the orphanage. Life resumed its quiet rhythm, and Miss Marple, serene, observant, indomitable, knitted on into the evening, while Willowbrook Harbour breathed salt and roses beyond the lace curtains.